Hi, and welcome to this guide to funeral pricing presented by the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Pennsylvania. My name is Isabel Knight, and I'm a volunteer with the Pennsylvania FCA. And if you missed it, there's an intro video that's an overview to funeral planning linked in the description below. So just to get into it, the first thing I'm going to start off with is how to read a general price list. So a general price list is the term for kind of their list of prices that the funeral home is required to provide to you by law. So if you go in, they're required to give you a printed version, but often you can also get it over the phone. Or what I like to do, this isn't legally required, but often they will email it to you as well. So a general price list looks a little bit like this, and the first thing that you'll usually see is a basic services fee, right? So that covers all of the the request for service, the services of the funeral director, and so that is kind of a base fee that they will typically charge. And then on this next page, these are all of the baseline services that are required by law for the funeral. They are the same across all different funeral homes. So forwarding remains, receiving remains, direct cremation, and immediate burial. And I'm just going to highlight this immediate burial. You'll see that there's a range of prices here. And typically that's just the price of whether or not you're buying a container or a casket with them. And so you'll see that adds another like $1,000. Typically, if you look online for caskets, like the funeral home doesn't actually keep caskets on hand. Most of the time they're just ordering it from somebody and overnighting it. You can do the exact same thing and it'll cost you a lot less. So that's a really good option. And let me direct you to this direct cremation section. So I'm just going to zoom in on that for a second. So you'll notice that when you read the fine print that the direct cremation doesn't actually include the price of the cremation. It says, nor does it include the actual, cost of the cremation process. So that's something that you always have to kind of look out for, is read the fine print and see whether it's actually even including, the service that you're trying to buy. And so this next third page is an itemized list of all of the services that they offer outside of those basic services. So, if you are going for an immediate burial, that's not even going to include a graveside service. It's going to assume that no one's showing up. And so if you want those services, you can find that on the third page, and you can add that on. But as you'll see, there's things like embalming, caskets, other preparations, and that kind of thing. A lot of those things, if you buy a casket and urn outside, you're not allowed to be charged any kind of penalty for that. So just to give you a sense of how much costs vary across the country, this is just a graphic that I pulled from the internet, and you'll see that it can vary pretty drastically. This is made for Pennsylvania, so in the Philadelphia area, you see we're kind of in the middle, and so I'm just going to give you a sense of more local. I'm based in the Philadelphia area. Prices for this particular area, and you can find all of this on the Funeral Consumers Alliance website. So if you're not based here, you can go and look up your town and find all the funeral prices that we have for your area. So just to walk you through this, there's basically a pretty big variation, and you'll see in the last three columns is like the difference between a direct cremation without a container and with a container can vary a lot based on how much they're charging you for that container. But don't necessarily, the container is really just like a cardboard box, right? Don't necessarily assume that just because, they're charging you, a lot for that cardboard box that actually, that'll be a higher cost overall, because maybe their basic services fee is pretty low, right? So you just have to look at all of that together. These are burial prices based on immediate burial. Again, this doesn't include the cost of a box or a container. So it's assuming that you're going to bring your own, or, that if you have to buy it there, that'll be an additional cost. But you'll see that this is sorted by price. So this ranges from like $1,000 to like $7,000. So there's, again, a pretty big range in these types of services. So a lot of people will often ask us, whether they should prepay for their funeral and if they'll save money by doing that. And our advice is typically to say no for a number of reasons. The first is that the prices for the services that you are, paying for might go down, right? For example, there's been a big increase in cremation in the last few years, and so that means that the cost of plots might go down because there's going to be less demand. It's also, because of efforts like ours, we're trying to promote more price transparency, and so that could also be driving prices down. The second reason is because the funeral home might be sold and might go out of business, and so if they do sell it, then maybe like the next owners will not honor those contracts. The third reason is that the merchandise might just, be discontinued or no longer exist. And there are definitely items that cannot be prepaid for. So that is another thing to worry about. That kind of goes into this expectation that I think a lot of people have when they're trying to prepay, that everything will be taken care of and they won't have to do anything. That kind of white glove service isn't really actually available most of the time. So don't have that expectation. So lastly, I'm going to give you some tips for how to have the funeral you want for the price you want. So especially if you're on a budget, here are some ways to cut down on the prices. The first is to always make sure you ask for the general price list, because sometimes people will buy these products without even knowing what the prices are. So that's something that you should always be aware of and really, really try to shop around, right? Because you can see really widely varying prices in different places. And so if you are looking for one of those basic services like a direct cremation or an immediate burial, where there's not going to be any kind of service involved and people don't have to go there, then really consider shopping farther afield, because you can, if you go farther away, it could be that you find a place that actually is way cheaper than places that are in your immediate area. Definitely also consider buying a casket online, even making your own casket or using a shroud. That can be kind of a meaningful legacy project if that's something that you're interested in doing it yourself. You can also use their alternative container, which again is really just a cardboard box if you're trying to cremate, and you could also use a cremation casket for burial. So when you are, actually disposing of the body, you can have multiple options in terms of how you preserve the body prior to that. One is embalming, but you can also opt for refrigeration. That's something that some funeral homes, not all of them, have. And that can be also kind of a more eco-friendly thing to do, rather than pumping someone full of formaldehyde, which is what the embalming process really is. Or you could also have a viewing or service at home. Instead of going to a funeral home, just like, with if you've heard of like the wedding tax, a lot of venues, if they know you're having a wedding, will have a huge upcharge. I mean, the same is really true for funerals. So if you do want to have a service and you want to have a viewing, you can try to put things, have the viewing right before the service, so that you're not taking up the funeral director and the staff's time more than you actually need to. And you could also consider having a more memorial service elsewhere, not the funeral home, because that'll also typically save you a lot of money. And you could consider buying prayer cards, register books, or any of the other things that you need elsewhere as well. Another thing, lastly, is finding a cemetery that doesn't require a vault. So a vault is this concrete liner that typically goes around the casket. It's used to make it easier to mow the lawn at the cemetery, and it's something that a lot of religions are against. But if you don't want to have to pay for that vault, which can be pretty pricey, try finding a cemetery that doesn't require that. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have any other questions about your specific situation, please feel free to reach out to the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Pennsylvania at the information listed here. And hopefully this was helpful. Thanks.